Good morning to those in the United States and good afternoon to everyone tuning in from Europe. My name is Johan Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's virtual discussion on unpacking the new US-EU trade deal. This discussion is part of the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Economic Dialogue series, organized by the Europe Center and our partners at the Geoeconomics Center at the Atlantic Council, where we look at the key trends, issues, and challenges in the economic relationship between the United States and Europe. Less than 3 weeks ago, as everyone here will be aware, when the original July deadline was extended, we hosted an event looking at the future of transatlantic trade and what sort of deal or not we could expect between Washington and Brussels. Now we have an answer, kind of. On Sunday, European Commission President von der Leyen met with US President Donald Trump in Scotland to put the final touches on and then announce the Turnberry deal. The meeting culminated in something of a deal, or more accurately, maybe a framework or a political agreement for a future potential trade agreement, thereby averting an imminent escalatory trade war between the world's largest trading partners. The main items of this preliminary deal, as many will be aware, include a 15% baseline tariff on most EU imports, which is a step down from the threatened 30%, and we can discuss that with our panel a little bit. A commitment from the European Union to buy $750 billion worth of energy products from the United States, a further pledge from the European side to invest an additional $600 billion in the United States, and some commitments, rather vague, I would say, for Europe to buy US military kit. President Trump celebrated the deal by calling it the biggest of them all, quote unquote. In Europe, however, we have seen many not being so happy with the deal, and a lot of criticism, including of the European Commission's negotiating strategy. President Macron, for instance, criticized that the EU was not feared enough in the trade negotiations. But we're not done yet. We're already seeing some differences in the readouts and the fact sheets from both sides. And in the interpretations of the details still to be negotiated. So to unpack what that new agreement means, to discuss the negotiated conditions thus far, what we should be watching as this gets spelled out in more detail, and what the deal means for the future of the transatlantic partnership and economic relationship, we have a great virtual panel of transatlantic trade experts and watchers affiliated with the Atlantic Council. We have Fran Burwell, a distinguished fellow at the Europe Center and a managing director for Europe at McLarty Associates. Great to have you back, Fran. Similarly, welcome back, Dan Mullaney, a non-resident senior fellow with the Europe Center and the Geoeconomics Center, and a former assistant U.S. trade representative for Europe. And last but not least, Eric Bradberg, a non-resident senior fellow at the Europe Center as well, and managing partner and co-founder of the Brzezinski Global Strategies. Welcome, Eric, Fran, and Dan, to help us to help answer some of these questions and build a dialogue across Washington and Brussels. We're delighted to bring you all together. We really do want to hear from our audience as well. So please, the audience is welcome to submit questions at askac.org, askac.org, and I will try and come to these towards the latter part of our events. And with that, I want to dive in. Fran, you've been watching this from day one of this administration. We've seen some ups and downs in this negotiation process. Really want to get a sense from you what your main takeaways are from this broad agreement and from the reactions that we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as, really the balance of the deal. Is this a good deal for Washington and for Brussels, for the United States and for Europe?
So I think that whether it is a good deal or not depends on who you are, where you sit, so to speak. I think that having some definitiveness about the rate, the 15% rate, will allow businesses to start to plan. They won't be happy about the rate, but it's not 30%, as you pointed out. And it does allow them to start to think about, do they continue with exports to the United States? Do they think about relocating some of their investments to produce in the United States? You could start to make some decisions. We don't know how much predictability there will be from the rest of the agreement. There's still a lot of negotiations to come forward. And as we know, President Trump is not predictable himself. And so there is some uncertainty, but I think that having the 15% starts to answer some questions by business. I do know, and I hear from European colleagues, that the 15% rate is really, to say it's not desirable is an understatement. There has been a lot of criticism. You mentioned President Macron. His prime minister was even more forthright. But I think that those who wanted 10% or a return to tariff levels that predate the Trump administration, this was not realistic. The question was the EU going to get 30%, 20%, or 15%? And I think those who point to the UK, it's a much smaller economy, and it has, according to USTR, a modest surplus in, the US has a modest surplus in goods trade with the UK. Also, of course, the president does clearly have a warm spot in his heart for the UK, thanks to the golf courses and the royal family. We're seeing now India at 25%, South Korea and Japan at 15%, Brazil at 50%. 15% is likely, I would predict, to be pretty standard when the final rates all come out tomorrow. I don't think we'll see many with lower rates than that. In some industries, such as pharma, this deal offers some stabilization. It's not the 200% tariff rate that the president has threatened. We will see how pharma is affected under the 232, but pharma from the EU has now a ceiling of 15%. Autos, the rate was lowered from 27% to 15%, so that's good for that industry. It's not what they wanted, but this is the reality. And as you mentioned, the EU made promises about investment, energy, and defense, which I think were things that they were largely going to do anyway. The amounts are very much inflated. And there is quite a bit of smoke and mirrors there. But it is something that was clearly important to President Trump, as the White House fact sheet makes very clear. The EU, to those in the EU who are criticizing this deal, they really didn't give up anything on regulation, even in the digital space. So I do also think it was a win for both the leaders. The President Trump had the optics of being at his own golf course and having the most important trade deal with the most important trading partner come to fruition. And for Ursula von der Leyen, it was a high-risk strategy. There's no denying that. And although she's getting a lot of criticism domestically, I think it has allowed her to establish a very strong relationship with President Trump, which will be valuable for the EU going forward. I have to say that I don't think President Trump has ever been nicer to the EU than he was in the post-deal press conference. And that's important. It's important that he's not constantly saying how bad the EU is. So like all trade agreements, there are winners and losers. The biggest loser, however, I think, excuse me, unfortunately, is the US-EU relationship. This deal and the way it was negotiated from the US side will push Europe even more to embrace a version of economic competitiveness and security that is wary of any dependence and perhaps even any engagement with the US and its companies. And I think that some of our companies are going to find Europe a much more challenging market than it has been in the past.
Thank you, Fran, for putting a lot on the table there. I want to come back to a number of points, but first go to Dan. You've followed this equally closely from day one of the Trump administration's second term, President Trump's second term. Been some real roller coaster experiences, especially on the EU, US EU negotiations, where the EU was unclear whether it would get a deal. The threat of the highest tariff threat that I think President Trump made with 200% on European spirits. And then really a last minute dash to that surprised some or many that already believed there wouldn't be any deal. So what do you make of the agreement that was announced from Scotland on Sunday, the reactions since then, and a US specific perspective? Does this deal achieve what have emerged as the key priorities for President Trump's trade and international economic policy agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Yeah, it's been a real roller coaster. And I think happily we ended up on a high at the very end. I think it is very important in terms of judging the agreement and whether it achieved the U.S. purposes that there was some extraordinarily positive messaging about the EU, which is in stark contrast to the conventional wisdom about how President Trump feels about the EU. There's also a huge emphasis on the win-win nature of this deal. I mean, there are going to be different opinions as to whether it's win-win or not, but the president clearly articulated that he thought it was a win-win. The fact that he thought that was important, I think it is significant. And of course, as Fran said, it brings stability to the relationship. So I think those are all real positives. I mean, the thing that we need to watch is going forward, we will likely have a more detailed fact sheet about what was actually agreed, because you have this one side of the agreement that gets all the headlines, which is the tariff level. And for the EU, everybody hates 15%. On the other hand, it's comparable to Japan. It's better than India and several other countries, not as good as the UK. But overall, on the tariff side, the EU hasn't done terribly. But there's this whole other side where the president keeps talking about the unfair trade practices and stopping our exports and the trade deficit. And that part we haven't really seen. It hasn't been highlighted aside from President Trump's broad statements of unfairness. So I anticipate going forward that we'll probably have some kind of a joint statement or more articulation of what the particular non-tariff barriers to trade, maybe some tariff ones as well, that we're going to see. And those are going to be in the regulatory space. So I'm going to be watching very carefully today, tomorrow, maybe next week to see what fact sheet comes out, not the individual fact sheets, but a joint fact sheet or a joint statement. And I think that'll be really important, because one of the achievements of the deal, if I can put it in those terms, is I think it has maybe jump-started a serious negotiation over things like these non-tariff barriers, over trade deficits, and whether that represents imbalance, and what do we need to do to address those. So I think in terms of ultimate success, a lot will depend on what are laid out as the non-tariff barriers that will be under discussion, the details of some of these purchases, which are supposed to sort of counteract the goods trade deficit. What are the arrangements we're making in steel and aluminum, for instance, to coordinate with the EU on non-market policies and practices? And I think that's really where ultimately this deal should be judged. How well did we jumpstart a negotiation on all those particulars, which we just haven't seen yet? I mean, I would also say I think that the tariff levels. I mean, a lot have been said about the tariff levels. I don't think the tariffs themselves necessarily represent a real success, because they are a tax. They do increase prices. They're a blunt tool of trade policy. There are maybe better ways to achieve the objectives, and superficially, at least, the tariffs are there to counterbalance all of these non-tariff barriers and trade deficits and other things. So that tells me that the ultimate win for a deal like this will be, has the United States and the EU and other trading partners started a discussion about how we address some of these non-tariff barriers, how we address trade deficits. I think that will be the ultimate win. And it's really when you don't need tariffs to counterbalance unfair trade practices. I mean, that's where you end up in a good place in the relationship.
Thank you, Dan. Also, a number of points I want to come back to, but first to Eric. We can't ignore the broader geopolitics, that the geopolitical context of this deal and the last few months, especially for Europe, as Europe has been trying to keep President Trump in the United States on site in terms of continued support for Ukraine, for Europe to gain some time to ramp up its defense spending and capabilities, rearm in face of a Russian threat. But also, just last week, we had a sort of very contentious EU-China summit, where, which was a symbol of the relationship with Beijing deteriorating further for Europe in light of China's predatory or non-reciprocal, non-market practices that are putting key European sectors under pressure. There are other factors like the energy relationship. So my question for you, Eric, Fran has argued this is a major achievement and a risk to take for President von der Leyen. But was there really any other deal, given this geopolitical context, any other deal to be had for Europe at this point?
Sure. Well, thank you, Jorn, and greetings from Stockholm, Sweden, where I can tell you the mood about the deal is not necessarily all that positive, but I think there's also a degree of relief that there is a deal, there is some stability now. Look, my view is, I think it's hard to kind of imagine that the EU could afford not signing a deal with President Trump at this time. And I think there's kind of three big reasons for that. I think the first one is the fact that other major trading partners were signing deals with Trump. The UK, Japan, as was mentioned. I think just today we had South Korea. So I think for the EU to kind of be left alone, not having a deal, and have Trump focus all of his kind of retaliation against the EU, would make the EU more inclined to actually sign a deal. I think it would be a little bit different if, like, the major G7 countries, the EU, Japan, Canada, would kind of come together and say, we're going to unite, we're going to be aligned and push back against Trump. Certainly the EU has a lot of tools. It is the world's largest trading bloc. It has the anti-coercion instrument. If it wanted to push back, it certainly could. But I think it didn't want to be the only major trading partner doing so. It would expose itself, I think, a lot to Trump's retaliation. I mean, also just here in Stockholm this week, the US and China were meeting, and although they're not at a deal yet, I mean, I think from Brussels and from European capitals, the possibility that the US and China would align while the EU is kind of battling both Beijing and Washington, that's not really a good outcome. So I think they kind of, took the best deal that they could get, even though it's, as discussed, is far from the ideal deal that Europe was looking for. I mean, as early as, June, Europe was still pushing for kind of zero tariffs on industrial goods. They have to settle on 15%. But I think, as discussed here, and as we'll talk about, when you look at some of the details, there's also, some things that the EU stand to benefit from here. So I think that's the first reason. I think the second reason, as you alluded to, Jorn, is really the geopolitical environment here. I mean, getting dragged into a tit-for-tat transatlantic trade war at a time when Europe remains, completely dependent because of years of underinvestment in defense on the United States for defense against Russia and NATO, and for support, for Ukraine, is really not the right timing to do this. I mean, coming on the heels of, I think, what was a relatively successful NATO summit in The Hague last month, where, Europeans agreed to spend 5%, 3.5 in defense, 1.5 in sort of defense-related expenses, and have the Trump administration really kind of, clarify its commitment to NATO, its support for the transatlantic alliance. And then I think in recent weeks, we've seen Trump kind of moving a bit closer to the European position, if you will, on Ukraine, allowing for, providing some of these, military equipment like the Patriot missile systems, which are so important for Ukraine's security and defense against Russian airstrikes, albeit in a different manner, having the Europeans kind of purchase and pay for them and then provide them to Ukraine, but nevertheless not blocking those military deliveries. I think that's very important. And also signaling, a willingness from Washington to take a bit of a tougher approach against Moscow. Trump now apparently shortening the 50-day kind of deadline to 10 days or something, as we heard in Scotland. We saw even in the US-India trade discussions, the Trump administration singling out India's trade with Russia, especially of energy products. So I think all of these things means that for Europe, at a time when transatlantic cooperation on NATO, on Russia, Ukraine is so important, this was not the time to pick a big fight with the United States over trade. And we certainly know Trump's willingness to really link security and economic issues. So if he's upset with Europe about something on trade, it's very possible that he could then use something like military assistance as a form of retaliation. It would have been very different, I think, if Europe was not as dependent on the United States, if it had a stronger military power on its own. I think it would have been more willing to resist and push back and use the kind of clout and influence that it really does have in the economic space. So that's the second reason. The third reason, I think, is the fact that I think Europe is kind of banking on that Trump is very big on big announcements and maybe less big on follow through. So some of the things that Europe pledged to do, 750 billion in purchases of energy and defense and all of these things, in many ways, these were things that Europe was doing anyway. And Europe, since certainly the start of the Ukraine war in 2022, has been increasing its purchases of American defense equipment. Some 2/3 of EU defense spending comes from the United States, buying American LNG and so on and so forth. So these were things that Europe was doing anyway. And I think we should read this as kind of, a commitment, a desire to do more. But I think there's also a degree of flexibility here in terms of the specifics and the timelines. Again, kind of similar to the NATO summit, where in that case, we had a 10-year horizon, 2035, to reach the 5% target. In this case, 2028, by which time Trump will be a lame duck on his way out, maybe not as focused on these issues. So I think Europe felt like they can kind of afford to do the things they're doing anyway, commit to things that may not necessarily, add up at the end of the day, and hope that they can kind of ride this out. So I think for all of those three reasons, Europe felt like this was the time to strike a deal, even if it wasn't the perfect deal, in order to have stability and predictability and a workable relationship with the Trump administration.
Thank you, Eric. You built the segue to the second round of questions on the details. Before I do that, two quick things. One, reminding our audience to jump in with their questions at askac.org, askac.org, and maybe follow up immediately, Eric, on a couple points you made or that you hinted at. President von der Leyen said to one of your points in her statement that this agreement is the second building block in reaffirming the transatlantic partnership after the NATO summit that you also referenced. That was explicitly in her statement. At the same time, we've seen some pretty serious criticism from European member state leaders, from business associations, from elected members of parliament at the EU and national level, calling this, between a fatal sign for the future of transatlantic trade to, Trump has won, no doubt about it, those kind of reactions. How much does this expose President von der Leyen and also the European Union institutions in a political sense that they gotten this deal, even if you say, and others that would agree, say, this was the best deal to be had. It's playing for time. It's comparatively equitable to other major trading partners of the United States. How much of a political problem do you see, potential for a political problem do you see here for President von der Leyen specifically, but also the Commission and the EU level having negotiated this deal?
Well, von der Leyen and the Commission wouldn't have agreed to the deal if they didn't have major member states behind them. They had a mandate to reach a deal, and that's what they did. At the same time, you're right, there's been a lot of criticism. I think that reflects both domestic political kind of opportunism. It's very popular to criticize Trump in Europe. You score a lot of domestic political points by doing so. So I think there's a lot of that going on. I also think it reflects a frustration, and I think that's what we hear from, for instance, President Macron of France, a frustration with the EU's lack of geopolitical clout, and that is a legitimate criticism and concern. But that's not, I think, a reason to complain. That's a reason to get your own house in order and get your act together, investing in becoming a stronger geopolitical power militarily, economically, politically, and so on and so forth. So while I do think, we're seeing criticism against von der Leyen and the Commission for agreeing on the deal, I don't think it's necessarily, a huge deal breaker. And I think, ultimately the deal will still need to be approved by member states. I expect that they will be. And the fact that we have major governments like in Berlin and in Rome and elsewhere across Europe supporting the deal, I think means that there is still broad-based support for the approach. But of course, there will have to be, I think, a period of reflection here in Europe, not just in Brussels, but across Europe, about why is it that the EU, despite being the biggest trading bloc, despite having a lot of leverage, basically we're forced to agree on a deal that was less than ideal. And I think that should force some reflection and thinking, and also recognizing that the world that Europe is used to and likes to see, a world that is rules-based, where there's multilateralism centered around the WTO, well, that world doesn't really exist anymore. So you also have to adjust and be willing to operate in today's complex geopolitical environment. And I think, I would welcome those kind of reflections across Europe.
Thank you, Eric. Very clear. Fran, I want to ask a similar question to you and just get your sense on how much of a political liability this really is. I think the member states, to Eric's point, also not all member states always played a very constructive role here, to put it mildly, right? By suggesting different strategies at different points of that roller coaster ride that Dan and I referenced over the last half year. What do you make of the political reactions and fallout thus far on the European side primarily?
I do think that there has been a lot of domestic political opportunism, as Eric has said, and I think there has been a lot of frustration. One thing that we have seen is, as the negotiations proceeded, and as there were more briefings from the Commission to the member state leaders, you saw the member state leaders prior to the actual deal coming out becoming more aligned, people realizing that you couldn't just say, we want a quick deal, without actually figuring out what the deal would be and what was the United States willing to do. It takes two to reach a deal. And one can certainly criticize President Trump for his belief in tariffs, which isn't shared by most economists, but that's the way it is. And so I think that there was a collision here between EU expectations of a rules-based trading system and what President Trump is trying to achieve in terms of domestic politics and, to some degree, domestic economics. I think there has been a lot of frustration about whether the EU should have retaliated earlier or been stronger earlier. But I would point out that China is the one that has been able to get the US to back down a little bit. But China overnight put its tariffs up to 147%, something that the EU just is not going to be able to do. Its processes, its willingness to take the domestic hit in economic hit is just not there. Furthermore, the Chinese hold the keys to critical minerals that the US is very much dependent on. I cannot think of something that would play the same role in the US-EU relationship in terms of having US dependence on an EU product that could be effectively embargoed, which is what the Chinese did. I am a little bit more skeptical than Dan that there will be a joint statement. I think what we're going to see now is an ongoing negotiation with things coming out, on occasion. I think what Dan said about non-tariff barriers and that you should have the tariffs can be high and that will give an incentive, some leverage to negotiate those. I don't think that President Trump is going to lower tariffs from the 15% in response to any more measures by the EU. This is about funding the deficit and rebuilding American industry. I think it's going to be hard to reach agreement on steel and aluminum because of that, because I think he's going to want to keep those tariffs high. And so if that's the situation, I'm not seeing a lot of incentive for the EU to engage in negotiations on non-tariff barriers. So I think we're going to have a little bit of little things that come out. And as we've seen with the British experience, it's been what, 3-4 months, and they still don't have a detailed agreement. So I think that we are going to see predictability on the tariff level, and we'll see some movement on some things, putting things in that industrial category that has 0 tariffs, but not a whole lot of movement on many of the issues that feature, for example, in the U.S. National Trade Estimates reports.
Thank you, Fran. And you and Eric already moved us towards the focus on the details to be worked out still under this framework deal. And so I want to come to Dan because you referenced, you'll be watching closely what's happening on the regulatory and non-tariff barrier front, what we might see in more detailed announcements between the United States and the European Union. That's been a long-standing concern and long-standing disputes between the United States and the EU, as you know all too well. And as many in the negotiating team and among the leading leaders of the team on the US side have always pointed out this list that, of non-tariff trade barriers. President Macron has said this isn't over yet, if I paraphrase. Fran is saying this is pretty much over in terms of getting more detail. What's your take on that? Especially on that non-tariff / regulatory barrier side of things.
Well, first of all, I think Eric and Fran are exactly right on the pushback that you see in Europe. But I also, and the reasons for it. And it is a bit rich that having given the commission a mandate to do this, they're now jumping up and complaining that she did this, what they gave her a mandate to do. So, but I also think that narrative is actually a bit useful to the Trump administration because to the extent that there's a narrative in Europe that you got taken to the cleaners, maybe Trump likes that, whether it's true or not. So, but I think also, and this may be the more significant part, the fact that there is this pushback and this question about whether the EU should have taken a harder line, should have retaliated like China did. I think that indicates, or that suggests maybe a little bit of frailty going forward. Because I think that's important. I mean, I think this is not the deal that will now just sit as the deal. I mean, there will now be follow-on the purchases, on the non-tariff barriers that you mentioned, Jorn, that are very complicated, very challenging, and it can go one of two ways. One, there can be serious engagement on some of these barriers, and they do exist on both sides, on the US side and on the EU side. If there's serious engagement on those barriers and we make progress, then the deal is a success. If this is regarded by Europe as an exercise in rope-a-dope, I think that could prompt on the Trump administration side some other actions to move things forward. And that second time around, I'm not sure that the balance would necessarily land on let's work with the Trump administration to get a deal. So the next time, and there will be a next time, because I think there's going to be a lot of discussions about this whole range of non-tariff barriers, some legacy, some new. So there are lots of opportunities for things to get difficult. And when they get difficult, will the commission still feel that they should be constructively engaged with the US or not? I think that's a real question. So I think in this, the pushback in Europe is more informative for me in terms of the fragility of the deal going forward and all the work that needs to be done on steel and aluminum. I mean, huge unanswered questions on, how do you address the steel and aluminum issue? I mean, I've given up predicting what President Trump thinks or what is going to happen, and that's probably not useful. But I think that there are opportunities to free up trade in steel and aluminum between the United States and Europe, because Europe's not really the problem, and have a deal along the lines of some kind of a tariff quota, along with some protective measure against floods of Chinese imports into the European Union. I think that's a potentially workable outcome, but it's going to require a lot of work. I imagine there are going to be a lot of challenges with it, and given the potential fragility of the deal, that could present some challenges in the coming months.
Dan, we are at a think tank event, so some wild predictions and speculation is absolutely encouraged to a healthy degree. But coming to you, Fran, and I should say we're getting some good questions here from the audience. I'll try and weave them in as we enter the last sort of 20 minutes of the conversation. Fran, similar question to you on the details to be worked out. You already touched on it in your prior statement. But you specifically mentioned steel and aluminum, and President von der Leyen very much messaged strongly we should come to a sort of open market, a ring-fenced solution of some club solution between the United States and Europe. You mentioned that the negotiations left the digital rule book and digital regulatory agenda of the European Union intact. I think that's how you put it. But within a day or two of Sunday's agreement, we had Commerce Secretary Lutnick already mentioning, again, or focusing in public statements very much on the burden and the singling out of American companies from Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, other EU digital regulations. So what are you watching in terms of detail? Where do you see any areas of actually making some positive progress from this framework agreement? And where do you just think this, we're not going to go anywhere really on real substance?
Well, let me just first say that in reference to Secretary Lutnick's comments, that the one person who makes the decisions on trade policy in this administration is President Trump. That's very, very clear. And so what I tend to do is to listen to what President Trump says. And he's talking about a great deal. I think it's also true that President Trump is not necessarily a digital guy. It's not an industry that he's had a lot of experience with. And I think one thing we do not know is the impact of no longer having Elon Musk around the White House all the time in terms of the president's focus on digital rules. I think the digital service taxes, as he demonstrated with Canada, are something that he understands and cares about. But the EU is not doing digital service taxes, it's individual member states. And we have yet to see how to revive the 301 that I think is still legally active. Dan can provide the details on that. So potentially there's something on that. But I think that most likely President von der Leyen made clear that things like the DSA and the DMA would not be affected by trade negotiations. Now, will there be things in the EU's simplification efforts that they're going through, particularly on the AI Act and other things that are coming forward that are likely, that could ameliorate some of the concerns of US companies? I think that's unclear at this time, but there could be very much. On steel, I think that what President von der Leyen wants is mostly a return to what we had before during the Biden administration, and that was a tariff rate quota based on historical average, how much the EU has normally exported steel to the United States. And then if you go above that, you get tariffs. And I think this is a way of understanding that it's not the EU that is sending a whole lot of surplus steel. The EU is mostly exporting to the United States high quality steel, sometimes steel products that cannot be found elsewhere. And I think that there is room for negotiating, particularly for those machine tools and others that are made of steel, but that companies in the United States need in order to manufacture and make the American economy grow. So I would look at that type of thing and whether they can be defined not as steel, but as an industrial product, which right now, according to the deal, are getting 0 tariffs. So I think there are little places like that in terms of definitions that we will see something.
Okay. Eric, thank you, Fran. Eric, turning to you. You spoke as one of your points in the initial responses about this investment announcement of 600 billion, the energy announcement of 750 billion, and how real they are. One question I have from the audience is taking a longer term view here. We are seeing much more emphasis on foreign direct investments in these trade negotiations by President Trump. Are we seeing the beginning of an increased alignment within G7 partners, considering the EU announcement, the Japan announcement, and others, when it comes to economic security and foreign investment? The foreign direct investment agenda and foreign direct investment screening, I think this viewer adds to this. So are we seeing something developing there on this front?
I think we have to see. I mean, I think there's been a degree of convergence in the G7 around, kind of broadly speaking, economic security issues related to China for a number of years. Certainly under the previous Biden administration, the G7 was very active on these issues. I think there's some, uncertainty now. I think the fact that we've now have trade deals, or at least, as we discussed, frameworks of trade deals between the US and most of its G7 allies, does provide a degree of stability that maybe allows kind of the G7 to come together now, coordinate more. I think it's very hard to sit down and kind of piecemeal break out some of these issues while you're fighting a trade war with the US. So hopefully, having an agreement and assuming, the US sticks to the agreement and there's progress, I could see how it now makes sense to sit down and talk about some of these issues, including in the G7. I think the challenge, though, is that it's not entirely clear where the Trump administration is on these issues, on China as a whole, and specifically on some of these FDI and export control issues. While the Trump administration has a number of people in top positions who are very hawkish on China, who wants to, pursue almost a decoupling type of approach to China, that's not necessarily where President Trump is. He wants to improve market access for American companies in China. We saw in the London trade meeting between US and Chinese officials last month that the US, for the first time, was willing to actually compromise on export controls, loosening some of the restrictions on software for semiconductor exports to China in order to get commitments from the Chinese side. So I don't think it's entirely clear where the US is on its own China and economic security issues on China, which in turn, I think makes it harder to then come together as the G7 to coordinate on those. But I certainly think from a European perspective, and we saw that again in the recent EU-China summit, I think the European view of China has hardened. And I think despite the transatlantic trade turbulence, there's no sign that I think the EU is going soft on China. If anything, I think the EU realizes that it needs to work with its allies to jointly confront some of these issues, including on export controls, on FDI, both inbound and perhaps outbound. So I hope that with this initial agreement and with other agreements, that there could be some progress on that front in the coming months.
At least opens the door to sum up. There's a question specifically for you, Dan. Can you speak more about how likely it is whether the US and the EU reach an agreement on the trade quotas on steel and aluminum, what tariff will apply on the pharma or chemical sector side. So I think that those are details to be worked out. But
having said that, I refuse to predict this kind of thing.
Somebody's pressing you on it, rightly so.
I guess I invited that kind of inquiry, didn't
Yeah,
I?
but maybe connecting it with Fran's assessment of sort of what are the areas where you see real prospects of. You spoke to this a little bit, but maybe specifically to the pharma issue, the steel and aluminum issue, what are some of those areas of opportunity that you think are most likely to, rare earths, obviously, if you can speak to that.
I can. I mean, one thing you can say is that all these sectors are complicated, and each one is very different. And they pretty much line up with the Section 232 investigation. So when it comes to steel and aluminum, the issue is non-market economy, excess capacity in China, and the knock-on effects of that. And that's a very different issue from, say, pharmaceuticals, which has to do with supply chains, trade deficits, and supply chains for active pharmaceutical ingredients on the one hand. That's probably the 232 aspect, and then the pricing issues on the other hand. These are very specific, bespoke issues for each of these different sectors. And so I think what that says is it will be complicated. I think it is doable to get a solution in these areas, because I do think, and it, I won't characterize the strength of this position, but that tariffs are kind of a blunt tool for achieving these objectives, and that there are better ways to achieve the objectives. If you want to push back on non-market economy, do an agreement that does that. Don't throw up 50% tariffs. If you have a challenge with pharmaceuticals, supply chains, or pricing, or the trade deficit, don't put a tariff on pharmaceuticals, because that just makes prices higher. So I think I think the incentive will be towards rolling up the sleeves and trying to address the very bespoke, tailor-made nature of each of these sectors. Is there a prospect of success? I mean, we tried steel and aluminum during the Biden administration. That didn't work. I think it was unfortunate it didn't work. I think probably the parties gave up too soon. And I think one of the reasons they gave up too soon is that there really wasn't a sense of urgency about fixing that problem. And so the parties walked away amid a certain amount of recriminations. I think we're past that point now. I think we're in sort of a crisis mode and urgency mode. And I think the parties are much more motivated to stay at the table, roll up the sleeves, get some solutions. I think it's interesting looking at the overall structure of these deals compared to what was said even back in January, because the Trump administration laid out a series of reasons why he wanted to put on tariffs. And of course, everybody said, well, it doesn't make sense. He's got too many reasons. They're inconsistent. But you need to look at those. He said, look, goods trade deficits are a problem. So he's got $750 billion in energy purchases to address that issue. He said loss of manufacturing in the United States is a problem. So he's getting some commitments, and you can argue about whether those are just already intended investments, but he's got various provisions about bringing in investments. He said, look, we have challenges with non-market economy policies and practices in China, and the deals that we've seen so far have talked about coordination on some of the supply chain vulnerabilities arising from non-market economy policies and practices and non-market excess capacity. So it's and then he said, in general, we're treated unfairly. We can't sell our products in Europe and other places. And there is, I think, a suite of things that are there to address some of these non-tariff barriers. So there's a pretty close lineup between what was articulated as the problem triggering tariffs back in January and the elements of these deals that are coming up. So I mean, you can still maintain perhaps that, well, the real point is just to have tariffs and everything else is just a smokescreen. We're just going to complain that there are non-tariff barriers and unfairness, not going to do anything about it, and just maintain 15% tariffs because that's what we like. That's a very plausible theory of the case. To my mind, there's another plausible theory, which is no, these tariffs are there to fix certain underlying problems, and to the extent that we can find an arrangement that fixes those problems that does not involve tariffs, there might be incentives to do that. And the one factor I think that we haven't raised yet is, the tariffs themselves impose a cost. They impose a cost on the stock market, the bond market, consumer prices. Inflation is a very sensitive topic. I think those price increases are sort of beginning to hit. So as we move forward, as the parties are addressing some of these other issues, these underlying concerns, purchases, investments, non-tariff barriers, we may also see some pressures on the US economy arising from the tariffs themselves. And the balance between, fixing the problems and having tariffs in place that counterbalance the problems, that balance may shift going forward, and in part due to these external factors of inflation, effect on the stock market, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Dan. Fran, I want to come to you with a question regarding, you mentioned in your opening remarks, the biggest loser is the US-EU will be the US-EU economic relationship. And I have some questions that I'm trying to combine here for you related to that. Really focusing on what do you think the likely long-term EU response will be, this intensifying maybe this diversification strategy, other trade negotiations with other partners than the United States. A question here, what are the real alternatives for the EU? More G6 solidarity, EU Global South rapprochement, a mix. And so what do you think the most likely trends in that respect have been kicked off here, and what are the EU's real options here?
I think the answer is all of the above. So I think that the EU is going to try to build a somewhat different economic reality, but it won't happen overnight. So President von der Leyen specifically mentioned the trade agreements with, I think it was Indonesia, Mexico, and the one that's being negotiated with India right now. These are huge markets. Not that they will necessarily replace the US market, but they do give more room for European business to expand into other markets that previously were not as available. So that's one thing that they will do. The EU is also very focused right now on its competitiveness debate. So this involves both simplification of existing regulations, which it's still not clear how far that will go. And I do think we'll still see a very strong regulatory culture in Europe. But a lot of state support and other very conscious leveraging of EU money to bring in private capital to make the EU's own industries grow and to focus on building that domestic economy rather than simply having low growth rates, but high trade with the United States. So I think that a critical debate that has been going on in Europe has been how much they want to ensure that their economy is open or versus an economy which preferences European companies in order to make those companies stronger. They're very aware that Europe does not have a globe-leading digital company, such as we have several here in the United States. And I think that they would like to see something like that happen. And the question is, in order to achieve that, will they put more obstacles in the face of US companies seeking to do business? This will apply in the defense realm, but also in most areas where government procurement happens. That's the real tool. So we'll see what happens. But I think that as we've seen the frustration and to some degree posturing among leaders in Europe about this deal, I think that has some real consequences as they look forward and think about whether the United States is a reliable economic partner in the future. And I think for many, if you ask them today, they would not see the US as a reliable partner.
Well, we just have that last audience question too that's very much related, and I'll pose it to Eric. The speakers, and we've touched on this partly, the speakers argue that this deal provides stability. However, this deal is not legally binding and President Trump can pull out any time and demand for more. Does this agreement, political agreement, provide enough stability for companies to continue investing in the United States? You work with a lot of private partners. Fran just hinted at it. What's your perspective on that question? And then I'll come to each of you with a lightning round question to close us out. But Eric, first to this question.
I mean, look, just very quickly. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of European companies looking at investing in the US, and I think a lot of them have told me that they're holding off on making big investments because of the uncertainties, not just tariffs, but also domestic kind of legislative uncertainty about some of the subsidies and so on and so forth. So I think having a deal does provide a degree of stability that allows companies to make decisions. I think it will vary sector by sector, but I could certainly see a scenario where, you know, if you're a European company facing 15% or whatever tariffs, setting up a factory in the United States is one way to avoid those tariffs. So that could incentivize FDI and investments, which of course is very much what Trump wants. In many ways, Trump and Biden wants the same thing: reshoring manufacturing, investments into the US industrial base, but they're using different tools. Biden's approach was subsidies, Trump's approach is tariffs, but the goal is ultimately the same. And I could see that this deal will provide some degree of stability here, but obviously it comes down to implementation. And we've seen time and time again, Trump agreeing on something and then changing his mind. So to the extent that this agreement, which we haven't even seen the actual text yet, and then we have to see, it has to be an executive order issued by the Oval Office, and then we have to see the implementation. So there's a long way to go, but I think it's at least a path towards a little bit more of a degree of predictability and stability that companies and investors are looking for.
Thank you, Eric. On a similarly positive note, the lightning round, quick answers, please. And that is, what is the one thing you would like to see as the United States and the EU hopefully fill out the details of this agreement that would realize the potential of a US-EU trade agreement? What's the one thing that would be on your wish list? Doesn't have to be tomorrow or next week, but down the line, to Eric's point about implementation, follow through, and really the potential of this relationship and getting both sides. We've seen a lot of questions around, you know, what type of agreement is it? How binding is it? If we really shift our attention of making the most of this agreement, what's the one thing you would like to see? And I'm going to put Fran on the spot first.
So I would say an agreement on steel. I think that the agreement as it is now has put the focus back on steel and aluminum. And I think coming up with some kind of an arrangement that addresses Chinese overcapacity while not penalizing the EU could be a model for other commodities and industries that find themselves in a similar situation. So a really tough nut to crack, but I think that's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Fran. Dan, over to you.
I think I would take that a little broader and say the whole suite of areas where the US and the EU can cooperate toward their common challenges globally. And this includes the suite of non-market economy policies and practices, but a number of other issues out there. So I think, you know, less focus on the bilateral disagreements, which we will always have, and more focus on common objectives that we can work on together and demonstrate that it is valuable for these two big trading partners to be working together.
Thank you, Dan. And Eric, to round us out.
So while the deal essentially means that about 70% of European exports to the US will face 15% tariffs, I think it was really interesting that the deal also recognized that there are certain critical areas that should have zero tariffs. aircraft components, some chemicals, semiconductor ingredients. Perhaps this can be used as kind of a springboard for really developing the concept and the notion of friendshoring, where there are these critical areas that we're mutually dependent on each other, that we should work on together to lower barriers and increase our collaboration as we both seek to reduce dependence on China. So that's a hopeful note for me. Identify more of those areas that we can work on that are really critical and are essential to national security for both sides.
Well, thank you so much to our three panelists. Thank you to our viewers in the United States and Europe for tuning in. Really appreciate the great perspectives, insights, and analysis from Fran Burwell, Dan Mulaney, and Eric Bradberg. Thank you so much to our viewers. Again, thanks for tuning in. Continue to follow the work of the Europe Center and the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council on all things transatlantic trade and economic relations through our transatlantic economic dialogues. For now, thank you to our panelists. Thanks for tuning in, and see you very soon.